started. All right, it's 9:30 or just after. I'll go ahead and call the Technical Advisory Committee for July 9th, 2024 to order. I'll take roll call. Please say present or here when your name is called. Steve Bicking.
Here.
Mike Von Bergen.
Here.
Al Schmidt. Thomas Rose. Okay. And then Mike Warner gave me an email. He or I would not be able to make it either. So I see Jody is here. We'll just see if she comes in. We'll call her again. Brian Valesky.
Here.
Bruce Meyer.
Here.
Gabe Powers.
Here.
Alex Strack.
Here.
Vince Moska.
Here.
Ryan Bieber.
Here.
Ernest Varga.
Here.
Darren Olson. Andrea Pizzo. Okay. Here. Brad Andresen.
Here.
And Tyler Wilkie.
Here.
And then we'll go ahead and mark Jody is here. Krista, she's using the restroom, I think, so. All right. We'll go ahead and move to approve the minutes from last meeting. I will mention there are two small revisions before I enter the motion. We had at the top, for some reason, we're still learning our system a little bit, but you'll see there is a members absent that listed everyone absent. We will go ahead and revise that. And then for the adjournment, we will go ahead and put the motion and who seconded that. So are there any other revisions or discussion for the minutes? Or do I hear a motion to approve them with the revisions?
I so move.
Moved by Ernest. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Steve. Okay. We will approve those. And looks like, hey, Darren. Krista, if we can mark Darren Olson as here. He was present. Thank you. All right. There is, moving along, there is no public comment that I see. So are there any members' comments at this time? No, okay. So we'll go ahead and move right into the old business for our performance standards. So much of our discussion on our post-construction BMPs. So staff discussed all of the ideas that everyone had in our discussion in terms of trying to be leaders and having the goals and how we're getting these BMPs and the standards and all of that. So what we felt like, as I go into this a little bit, we wanted to kind of address our thought process in terms of how to handle BMPs and just in general moving forward within the county. We felt that kind of the language here, we wanted to keep it a little bit vague in terms of you're not going to see any goals or standards or percent removals in the SMO, with the idea that as we do our watershed planning, we want to kind of have that be a separate document that is able to tally whether it's using EPA, TMDLs, or impairments, or whatever monitoring we come up with, whatever modeling we come up with to kind of keep track of all of that, since that's going to be a moving goal, a moving target. We wanted to have that lived separately and then be referenced such that potentially when you're going through your development and you're indicating, okay, I'm going to have potentially this pollutant to deal with and here's my proposed BMP, then you would also double check to see if there's anything else in that watershed that potentially you would need to take into consideration as part of that. And we felt that since those can be updated, maybe we do it annually or whatever that might look like, we're gonna have those discussions with the group coming up in the near future, but essentially whatever that would look like, if that's getting updated all the time, and then we have to update the SMO and then the municipalities, it just seemed like a cumbersome process to do that. So until we kind of figure out what we're gonna name that and what it's going to look like, we'll come back and reference that in. So what I want to say in terms of, item number 3, which was a big discussion for the identification of those pollutants, this is where potentially we can add to it or add an additional section that would pull from that other document based on that ongoing monitoring information that we're collecting, anything that might come up. So for the time being, what we looked at was to also address the idea of having some direction, though we don't want to leave it super open-ended. And we thought that potentially we can use the Illinois Urban Manual to set those minimum standards and criteria. So that was something that was updated or is still in the process of being updated. In 2020, there was a grant that was obtained through the saltwater conservation districts for Illinois. If you're not familiar, I'll just pull up real quick. For example, I had a rain garden up. It does a really nice job of going through and giving you the criteria and kind of all the things that someone should be thinking about when designing this. There's other BMPs where it gets specific to indicate a design storm. So it provides minimums, side slopes. So this document basically has all of that information. What the Urban Manual doesn't have is it's not a good resource to then say, well, what type of pollutant should I be using this for? Outside of some of you guys that are professional that can put that together, if we have other folks trying to use this and develop BMPs and things like that, that's a question that they're probably going to ask. And that was something where we were trying to find a good resource to figure out, okay, where do we want to go? What do we want to reference to marry the Urban Manual with to have people to make it easy so they're not trying to figure it out. And the best that we came up with was this International Stormwater BMP database through the Water Research Foundation that Geosyntec is a contributor. And it's not something that I'm very familiar with, and I haven't read through this whole thing, and in talking with Brian, we could potentially get, who are the 2 people here, Mark or Paul to kind of talk more on it, but what it does a nice job of doing is it goes through and breaks everything down, all the considerations, and I'm just gonna go to the first kind of table just to demonstrate what we're looking for. So this would be for solids, total suspended solids. It goes through, like I said, and highlights everything, but then gives you the BMP, and then it kind of has this chart area that signifies whether or not there was a significant difference between the influent and the effluent. Outside of this, that was our thought, was to kind of marry the 2 together, or at least something similar, so now any engineer can identify the type of pollutants potentially for their site. They can go to the Illinois Urban Manual as kind of a minimum standard, or they can feel free to reference a more up-to-date case study that makes sense, and then come in and have some kind of chart like this to try to help them to figure out, okay, if I need to do total suspended solids, what are my choices, what makes sense. So that was kind of the idea behind this first portion in terms of the BMPs and identifying the pollutants, having a source to then figure out what the design standards are going to be, and then figuring out a source to marry that to indicate, is that BMP an actual good way of dealing with that pollutant. So this is, I don't know how many of you have seen this. I didn't see it until recently, so I can send this out. It's a fairly large document, 118 pages, so I didn't want to put it into the agenda, but I can send it out, and if that's something that we want to look at anyway. That's kind of where I wanted to start the discussion, unless somebody else had kind of another resource that's kind of easy to go to. But this would also be something that's constantly updated, as I understand it. So as new information comes out, as things change, again, we're trying to build in that flexibility. So it allows you guys to be flexible, or that designer to be flexible, at the same time using the most up-to-date information without having to go through, again, a lot of SMO amendments and changes and updates that tend to bog things down. So that's where I'll kind of open it up for discussion. If you want, I can go through this a little bit. The idea wasn't to fully analyze this document, but just the idea that it's presenting. So, and I don't know, Brian, if you want to touch on this any more, if you're able to get any more insight from anyone at Geosyntec.
Yeah, I mean, the guy to talk to is Mark Leisenring. He's on our west coast. I mean, I think he'd be more than happy to chat, probably video call or something, if people have information. This is something that's been compiled over a long time, so it's not like it's anything that's just kind of popped up. It's been supported by different entities over the years, kind of, but it's always kind of had this central housing that a number of people have collaborated on over years. Through that, we're just a collaborator of it. We're not the full keepers of it, so. Just like the Illinois Urban Manual, it's not, I mean, that's kind of hosted by, forget the entity, but it's consisted of a bunch of volunteers, right, that have contributed to the Illinois Urban Manual as well.
I think that's a great resource. I just find it kind of interesting that the wetland channel is the worst BMP up there, so, which I find offensive. No, I mean, grass swale is better than a wetland channel. That's crap. No, I'll get back to my point of monitoring, is that, you know, all of our BMPs that we do now, there's blind faith in the design. And so that they work. If you design them to a standard, they work. So, and this says that they work. So for us to then require monitoring on top of that, that's where my heartburn continues, because we don't have any numeric standards and there will be pollution in the monitoring. And so what are we going to do with that? And that's where I remain concerned that we'll be providing a standard that will be expensive and problematic. So that if you do a detention basin, it'll automatically work with good design standards that you put in there. So if you do a wetland basin, it's going to work because the data says it works. So then to require monitoring to prove that it works, since it's already proven that it works, it's gonna be, that's gonna be expensive, like I said, and then when do you monitor and how many times do you monitor and all that stuff still remains a concern.
Our idea is to not monitor the individual BMPs that are being put in place for developments.
Okay.
The idea is to monitor the maintenance of them. So we want to, so this kind of ties into what Brad brought up last time I have under new business, and I guess we'll just jump around because the conversation is connected. But the idea is we're going to start to have everything on a GIS system, to use a tracking software that will allow us to input this information and set up different fields or data that would, on an annual basis, let's say you put in a certain BMP and we'd like you to, for maintenance purposes, confirm that you've maybe done however many tasks. You send that information to us, you then can track it in the system and we can see how it's doing. So we're not necessarily taking sampling or doing any kind of monitoring in terms of influent, effluent at the BMPs. But what we do want to do is kind of how the EPA has their own kind of apparent system and they're tracking things across the waterways. We want to be able to sample at specific points as well. And so what we're hoping to do is, through that process, we figure out where do we want to sample. Maybe that's going to change on an annual basis, or however that's going to look like. Again, those future discussions for us to kind of put that together. But then within each watershed, we would have these known sources that we're pulling data from. And hopefully that data, however we want to model this in the county, that data is going to feed into the model, that's going to feed into the system. And then we would kind of have an idea that if we're seeing certain spikes, is it a cause for concern, or can we analyze it in a way to say that, yeah, there's potentially a certain spike here, but then when we move downstream, it's normal, and we can help explain that, and maybe the watershed is operating fine. Or we can see that we have a particularly high spot in that watershed, and now we can pull up our resources to see that we have, maybe it was a bunch of certain type of BMPs that were being implemented in that watershed, that maybe, okay, now maybe these are somehow contributing to that or not.
So where would you anticipate, when you do sample, where would you anticipate getting the water? At an outfall of a detention basin, or in the water body, like
Well,
the creek?
I don't have the answer to that, and I think that's probably going to be watershed specific based on the watershed studies that we do. So I think those are the discussions we're going to have on the approach to each watershed, and probably doing some of the outreach and gathering the information, collecting that information. And we have to start somewhere, right? And maybe wherever we start, we're not on the mark, and we adjust as we go. So it's going to be a moving target.
Okay.
But that would be the idea, is we're not actually monitoring the individual BMPs that people put in place. We want to make sure that they're maintaining them as more research, as we gather more data. And that's going to be critical if we do want to set goals and guidelines for these watersheds. We need that data, otherwise we have nothing to say, to require 60% reduction. No one's going to buy off on that unless we can show that potentially a certain watershed is struggling to control that pollutant, whether it's in an urban area or in an ag area. So I do want to mention that the monitoring for this would be more of maintenance. Trying to figure out a way, is the owner doing the maintenance required for this BMP to still function as intended? And if they're not, one of the questions we would probably wrestle with is, how do we get them to do that? Because if it's just a fine and it's a small fine, they're potentially just going to pay it and say, okay, fine me again and fine me every year. Some discussions I'd like to have as part of that. I don't necessarily think we need to do it now, but if this idea seems appropriate and, people aren't concerned, or they feel like it's as straightforward as can be, but again, leaving flexibility, then that was kind of our intent, is to marry the Illinois Urban Manual and this resource and learn more about this resource. And maybe, obviously it's not the easiest to understand. You've got 3 diamonds, you've got, all these different stuff. I'll go to another one, all of a sudden the symbols change. So obviously there's a little bit of work to do there, but that's where, if Brian can get us in touch with the folks that know more about it, they can potentially give us some background, and maybe that's language we can incorporate to tell folks how to use this document, or we break it down separately.
One other thing, the idea is that the Illinois Urban Manual will be the minimum standards. So if a developer has a different approach, or you have a different approach, we don't want to stifle, innovation. But the Illinois Urban Manual will be the minimum standards.
Yes, Ernest?
I think the concept is good, but I'm afraid there's going to be a lot of devil in the detail kind of deals. And here's why. Let's say someone puts in a BMP. Let's say they do maintain it. And let's say there's a spike. Well, are you going to look to have the power to retroactively go back and say, your BMP's not working, change your BMP? Or is it just, well, lesson learned, we'll deal with it? That's the first one. Next one, I don't know how many monitoring points you're looking at. And the reason I'm saying it, there's a logistics to how many test samples, how often in a year, how many lab fees, how many bodies. I mean, there's a budgetary. So even if you're contemplating it now, and with all of our budgets going in right now, it almost couldn't go in until the 2026 budget. I mean, or excuse me, yeah, 2026 budget, because it's almost too late to squeeze in, even if you have notion. In addition to that first one, which was, okay, so now what do you do to the guy with the BMPs? I only know enough about ag to be dangerous, but let's take an oddity. Let's say something is applied to the fields, and let's say we have these oddball rain events. I mean, hey, there's hay that hasn't been cut once this year. That's how hard the rain's been. And all of a sudden, that causes a spike. And it could cause a spike in a test sampling. So the only thing I was gonna say is, if you get a spike in one sample, is that gonna turn on the sirens? Or do you say, okay, let's watch that one because we're monitoring every quarter, so, or we're monitoring twice a year, or whatever. Almost like I'm not a sports guy either, but like 3 strikes in baseball, I mean, they don't take you out of the batter's box till you've hit 3 strikes. I mean, I'm just seeing, I think it's a great, as I said, I started out, great concept, but those logistics are scaring me.
So you're gonna have to sample at the BMP, because if you sample in Nipperson Creek,
The dilution is gonna
you
be.
have all the ag and Genoa City wastewater treatment plant, Richmond, I mean, you would never be able to tease that out.
Yeah, because
So-
correct, and
Well,
those waste
So
treatment
that's why
plants
I
will
go
really
back
blow it
to
off the
This
market.
kind of thing is that the design standards, there's the data that says they work or they don't work,
Right. That-
which is great. And so, if I'm reading it correctly, it says that it doesn't work, none of them work very well for total dissolved solids.
Right, so.
So they actually increase, some of them increase total dissolved solid concentrations after the BMP, which is
Since this
kick
is
in the
an
head.
ongoing effort, the idea would be that we should probably have a good understanding of what these BMPs are releasing, right? Because we have this information. So again, I don't think we're at the point where we're thinking we're gonna be going and sampling at individual BMPs. And maybe I'm wrong on that, I don't know, but that's where that watershed plan would, hopefully with the modeling, we can potentially take some assumptions into account, factor those in to see if we can draw a reasonable conclusion. It's gonna be a case-by-case basis because of all the different factors. So if we can't draw a reasonable conclusion and say, okay, this is what we're expecting, this is kind of what we should continue to expect, and we're not seeing that, then potentially we need to come back to that sub-watershed or area and take a closer look at it. But there is no, like, if it's not, if potentially it could be related to a different practice, not related to the BMP, and if that happens, that's not something that we can potentially control on the SMO, but with our watershed plans, at least it gives us an idea that maybe we can start doing some outreach into those communities. We're hoping that with these watersheds, we're gonna potentially establish committees that are, through these communities that want to participate to potentially, have us as a liaison for technical information to indicate, hey, your watershed is potentially suffering from X, Y, and Z. And have them then, decide what are some of the steps that they'd like to see. Is it a project that potentially is on the list that can benefit, that we can get grant funding for? Is it a study that, an additional study that we just didn't anticipate that maybe we try to go for a grant for? I don't know. Obviously, if I had a crystal ball, I'd give you all the answers. But this is just one way, again, to keep that flexibility and allow us to at least have a starting point. Because once we actually get going, then we'd understand some of these different directions that we can go and need to take. And I think that's the big thing that we're missing here in all these discussions, is we just don't have that. The best information we have is anything that the IEPA can give us at this point, in terms of some of the resources for impairments and things that they have found. And we want to at least use that, but also build off of that. So to your point, can't answer any of those directly, but that's the idea, is that we would, try to figure out a blueprint to this watershed planning that would allow us to keep all of these things in mind and try to deal with them as they come up.
Could I ask for a point of clarification that may tie this together?
Okay.
Is it the idea that the watershed modeling and monitoring that we do would influence future standards, potentially,
Yeah.
but not retroactively going in and requiring BMP to be changed because as we do our watershed modeling and monitoring, we find something. We're not going to go back and require changes to existing BMPs.
That would be my feeling on it, but I don't know how the group feels, but yes, that's how I would feel on it. It would not be retroactive, because what we're trying to start out with is at least we have some information, so let's go with this. And if it's pointing us in a different direction, then I don't want to come back to anyone and have them suffer. We'll have to come up with a different solution, whatever that might look like.
So relying on the Illinois Urban Manual addresses your concern, Vince, where we don't have specific standards that we're requiring them to meet as far as reduction in dissolved solids or total suspended solids. But we're focusing more on the quality of the BMP and the maintenance of the BMP. Yep. And that at least gets us, provides a foundation that we then can build from.
So there's no ordinances that have numeric standards in Illinois, is there? Because Wisconsin's 80% solids removal, right? But that's still just, say, leap of faith or blind faith in the design. You do it to a design standard and you do your modeling, and you get 80%.
Well, and
So you have to prove that.
You can say
to
the
get
same
approved.
about detention modeling anywhere.
Right, but it has a number. We just have wet detention, which you may get to the same place, but there's no verification that you're getting it after the model says it's
Didn't
real.
Wisconsin come out with a bunch of documentation though on the decay of BMPs? That basically over time you can,
There's a threshold at which you have to,
Freshen them up.
that's probably a good term.
right?
But yeah, that there's a
Which
point at
nobody
which that your BMP will start to underperform and then not get the desired results that you are hoping to.
Especially like the rain gardens or infiltration basins, because they get clogged with, the cation exchange takes place and wet
So you
detention.
get your dissolved solids starting.
Right, so.
To speak to that, someone a couple of meetings ago brought up WindSlam, right? So potentially we would need to figure out a way to have a BMP evaluation tool then if we are going to start going towards specific thresholds and standards. That is one option, and as I understand it, Wisconsin has gone through the effort of producing data that's specific to your watershed or your region so that you can put it into WindSlam, put your site-specific details, then you can get a readout. So we would potentially have to undertake something similar. WindSlam is not a free program either, so we could look at some alternatives for that evaluation criteria if that would obviously be kind of the maximum level there, is we're providing a tool for the designer to use on their BMP to evaluate it if it gets a specific reduction in some pollutant that we feel is necessary. At this point, I just haven't looked further into that, just because we're not close. And I do want to be clear, we probably won't know what we're dealing with until we get through our watershed planning, which is probably a 3-4 year process. And that's if we can run them concurrently on 4 or 5 watersheds. So the idea is that's how we want to do it, but we have to design a really good blueprint that would be similar across the board. Maybe some of the more active ones, the Nipperson Creek area is an active watershed down by Algonquin, Crystal Lake. those are more active, so potentially we don't need to redesign the wheel in some of those areas, and we might have some of that information already in place. But if we have a consistent blueprint, I don't see why the execution wouldn't be there to be able to carry out. And then whatever those findings are, then, you know, I would say that's when we would actually have our starting point to then dive into some of this and figure out if we want to have BMP evaluation tools, if we want to set certain standards for watersheds. And it can extend further than that. We can get release rate specific, et cetera, et cetera. And Lake County has done that. They just have it in the form of an appendix where they have all their watersheds. For each watershed, there's a specific release rate. I think they just have one that isn't kind of the standard that you see everywhere, but that would kind of be the same idea. Although we don't want this to live in the SMO, because we want to have the ability to update it as we continue to assess and gather data. And so we don't want to update the SMO every time. We'd rather have it referenced. But we felt that was kind of the best way to allow us to have that flexibility, keep things moving along. So.
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
What's the expected update cycle for the SMO? Because, you know, just talking about having an appendix so we don't have to update, and I'm gonna take it, it'll come full circle in a second. I like a 30,000 foot view. So the way I'm looking at it, you know, we're right here, we're trying to get to here. We're not gonna go there in one jump. We're gonna need to make incremental changes to the SMO. You know, obviously it'd be great to have IPSCO samplers on the inflow and outflow of every BMP, you know, have thousands of samples. I did that for a CREP wetland laboratory in Iowa. That's incredibly expensive, time consuming. We'll probably never get there, even if that is the ideal, to have, you know, numerical standards, have active monitoring at all these BMPs, and then have an enforcement mechanism to make sure they're reducing the pollutants that we're looking for. I just got back from the National Stream Restoration Conference in New Orleans, went there last week, talked to a lot of people in the mid-Atlantic states, particularly around the Chesapeake Bay area. And the real driver of restoration and BMP maintenance in that area is the TMDLs into the Chesapeake Bay area. We're talking at a county level, I was talking to one county administrator, $150 million of watershed improvements in one county in 1 year. They have problems of not having the manpower to use the capital they have to spend in some of those areas. Totally different ballgame than what we're dealing with here. I think what would be helpful for me is how much of an incremental improvement are we looking to make with this revision of the SMO? On our way from 0 to 100, say, with 100 being the ideal. And what's that refresh cycle for, okay, we're gonna update the SMO and then we're gonna look at it every 5 years or 10 years after that. Just so we can kind of see as a group where on that ladder we're looking to shoot for. Because otherwise, you know, we can get way in the weeds. It's pretty easy to do that. But I think that would be helpful for me, especially being new on the committee, what that cycle looks like and where on that spectrum we're looking to shoot for with these revisions.
Well, I think that's open for discussion amongst the group in general, but I think what we felt was that the SMO would kind of be your design standard, kind of here's how you need to do stuff, and then the watershed planning that would exist in the comp plan, those watershed plans need to be updated in a 10-year cycle. So what the unknown part to that though is that I will concede is we're hoping that the watershed planning drives a lot of SMO changes. I don't know if that's going to happen rapidly or slowly, and I think it depends on the findings of those watershed studies. And so it could be inconsistent in terms of we might get 3 revisions in a year and then not touch it for another year or 2. I don't know if anybody has any other input, but that's kind of my best answer. I feel probably looking at a 10-year update for the watershed plans. And then the idea of updating the SMO would be to minimize it as much as possible so that the SMO references those plans in a way that we can update that on the 10-year cycle, or as the analysis comes in from the different monitoring, if we do it biannual or annual or whatever that is, such that if there's an update there that indicates that there's a high TMDL or whatever it is, and then that directly ties into the SMO, like, hey, you need to check this document to confirm that there isn't a TMDL in your watershed that you need to address, for example. So that makes it easier because that's not a document that needs to be passed through all the municipalities as well. That's gonna bog everything down. So that's why we kind of wanted to keep it separate. And so to start, the SMO is gonna kind of be the foundational piece of referencing these different documents of minimum standards of the Illinois Urban Manual. When you're selecting a BMP, come to this database, take a look at the watershed plans. So that's the idea or the starting point. And we can, we can manipulate that as the group thinks we should add more or potentially leave less. Now, we haven't discussed the watershed planning yet, something we're gonna get into. This is kind of the last document here piece that really, we started updating this in a couple of the other sections because we were anticipating MS4 changes on top of everything. So we were also trying to have our SMO changes, make sure that we can address some of the MS4 changes. So I don't want to lose sight that the MS4 still was the main driver of starting this process, but I think what will probably happen is we start to get into the watershed planning, they're both connected, right? And so as something becomes clearer to us and how something is gonna be approached in the watershed planning, we can come back and add that language in the amendment. And so this doesn't necessarily have to be I just wanted to have it as a good enough starting point that as we're working through watershed planning into MS4 drops, we can pivot, pass an SMO amendment now to potentially deal with any of that, or we can analyze and say, you know what, it's good enough, we can make some of these other changes first, so that when we get everything in order, we'll have all this kind of sitting in a bank of amendments, and we can come back and revise them as our watershed planning becomes clearer and is more developed, and then we'll, essentially have both ready. We can pass the SMO amendments, and then we can move forward in terms of pursuing the grants and talking to the board about funding these different components in the monitoring. And I don't know in terms of monitoring and the sampling, it is expensive, and so we might really have four opportunities. But I mean, there's within the municipalities, you have like Crystal Lake, like they're sampling that lake, and so that's a watershed where we can have information on. We're going to work with our municipalities and those stakeholders, but not all of them are going to jump on board right away, right? So it just depends, and if we feel that for what we want to achieve, we need 20 sampling stations outside of what our municipalities are able to contribute, we can only pay for 5, then we gotta make some tough decisions and figure out where we wanna place those 5 and have it as a future goal and figure out how we could potentially bring in more money to fund the remaining 15. But it's a moving target, it's an ongoing conversation, but that's kind of my starting area in my mind.
And it's a really good point that you bring up. You can't go from 0 to 60. The requirement for the Illinois Urban Manual is an incremental step, and that provides the foundation. And then in the future, as data comes in, it'll be data-driven changes moving forward. So it won't necessarily be on a fixed period, as Stoyan was talking about, but as data comes in and we have data to shape how things go, any future changes would then be data-driven. I'm sorry, I
and I think that helps, at least in my mind, kind of shape what our target is, even if it is a moving one. And I think with that being said, having as an incremental step, hey, we have this document that has done research that shows these BMPs if installed correctly, and if we're monitoring the maintenance of the BMP, I think absent of like a MS4 requirement for sampling, this is a good intermediate step with, I think sampling is gonna be the end goal, just if it's, if it's a year or 10 years down the road. Cause I know from a municipal standpoint, if all of a sudden we're required to do a large amount of sampling, even though like in Algonquin, we're one of the larger municipalities, we have a lab at our wastewater treatment plant. Even still, it's a struggle. I asked to do 15 sites within the village starting this year, and oh my goodness, and that's 15 sites, and I'm saying 3 times a year. And just even internally trying to train our people to get on board with that. And I think absent of like an EPA regulation that requires it, it's gonna be really hard if it's hard for me to do it in Algonquin for some of these smaller municipalities to follow suit.
And to the credit of the ordinance, you're not starting at 0.
Yeah.
You're already,
Yeah.
you're at 50% already because the BMPs are already required. So I think as a good thing. So we're not starting from scratch. So if water quality is the goal, we've already got that built in, front loaded in the ordinance, because you have to have hydrocarbon removal, RVR as best you can.
Right.
Mostly wet detention.
That's
So you're already good. You're already better than most states. I'll say that, most areas, because most of the state doesn't even have a standard at all for detention.
right. And we're hoping that with this outreach too, that the communities will come on board, that we'll be able to get volunteers that want to get involved, that, want to potentially sample for us and things like that. So it's just hard to know how that's going to evolve, but we want it to be as much of a grassroots effort as possible. And through these watersheds, develop a watershed community for people to be able to come to, get young people involved that are gonna be making decisions. I mean, part of this is developing a list of potential projects for communities to say, okay, we've got deteriorating, we wanna naturalize these channels and whatever it is, but then how do you make the decision if you've got 3 or 4 similar projects, which one is gonna go in for the grant application? That's not something we want to be involved with. We want to give those local communities an opportunity to potentially give them some guidelines, give them some structure, and have those discussions to figure out how they best feel it's best to, prioritize those projects and things like that. So, yes.
Just out of curiosity, are any of the counties around us doing anything? And I ask it for an odd reason. We came on board to something called the RWIS system at MCDOT. And this was probably 12 or 15 years ago. And what it is, it's a monitoring system, and it tells weather fronts. Now, the reason we came on board, other states had it. So they can get extremely accurate data tracking as a storm moves. Initially, we did not have the money for it. So I think we put in 3 initially. Then what they started saying is, okay, as we replace a county bridge, let's look, is this a critical area? Should we have one? Okay. This year, I understand, because we just had to secure 10 utility poles because the utilities won't let us put it on them. We're putting in 10 more. So what was initially 3, I think we're now coming up on like 20, or we will be at 20. And I'm just saying, without the others, this would be a stupid system. We'd kind of be dumb. So I'm just asking, let's say you do a monitoring along the Kish or the Coon as it drips into the Kish. Is Boone monitoring it, or are you able to be part of a system where they can say, oh my gosh, let's say you monitor the Nippersink, and let's say it's actually, using Vince's example, let's say it's actually Genoa City dumping. Well, if you don't have anything outside of your region, it looks like, oh my God, the Nippersink's contaminated. What the hell, let's stop. So is there any such on the surrounding, or has anyone even explored if any of the surrounding areas do something similar?
I'm not aware of anything. That is something that we do want to collaborate with Lake County, King County, Boone County. All of us, unfortunately, are at different points. And that was something that Lake County approached to us about to coordinate along the Fox, for example. So we have that idea in mind, that plan in mind, and that's where, again, we're not sure if the modeling is gonna lead towards, hey, let's go with this model, but is it too specific where no one else is going to use it? For trying to analyze these components. So that is something that we are mindful of. And I think in our discussions, we're kind of waiting to get a little bit further along with the discussions with you guys to figure out maybe what that's going to look like, or what are our different options, so that we can start to have those conversations and see where the others are at. But that sounds really nice.
Well, other counties and municipalities are doing watershed plans. And so that, you know, a lot of what he's talking about as far as water quality monitoring is not part of the SMO, but it's part of our watershed planning. So absolutely, other counties are doing this type of thing and looking more and more at water quality. But you know, a lot of it is done by the actual watershed groups. So it's not like the county is necessarily going to be the one doing all the monitoring. It's, you know, also going to be part of the watershed groups. We'll hopefully have some role in influencing how the watershed groups approach things and provide support. But a lot of this is actually going to be driven by the watershed groups themselves. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. The only other thing, and I know you're in the infancy, I understand. As you look to volunteers to possibly take samples, all I can say is be really careful on the way they sample, because you can screw up a sample like this, and all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, and you're like, no, you shouldn't have done that. And
No, I mean, we would obviously look for a program and guidance and you know, develop that. I'm not just, hey, who wants to sign up on a sheet, or, you know, you pull the number off those stubs.
I mean, all you need to do is store the bottle you're gonna sample in the wrong place in your house, and the chemicals that'll come into it, and you're like, oh my God, look what's in this thing.
Drop by my garage for a bottle, here you go.
Yeah, exactly. Don't do that, please.
There are, you know, standards and approaches for citizen science. So any type of citizen science data would have to fall within very specific parameters. It would not be a willy-nilly type of a thing. But
And
you've
it's
got
not
Chloride
guaranteed.
Watch, you've got River Watch, you've got other types of programs that have established protocols. So any type of citizen science would have to be following very stringent protocols. Your point's well taken.
I mean, IEPA samples, that's how you get on the 303D list, you know, which then gets you a TMDL eventually or something like that. Des Plaines River, they spent how much money sampling the Des Plaines through the wastewater guys, Fox River Study Group.
Right.
But you know, those are all main stem or tributary sampling, not BMP oriented. So that's where there's still, in my mind, kind of a little fuzzy line on any future sampling. Where do you do it if it's not at the detention basin? Because you'll never know if your system's contributing poorly or good if you're not sampling up the hill from the main stem. So.
Well, we're hoping to drive interest through this, and that's why I brought the volunteers, that potentially people would be curious to see how their BMP is functioning at a bare minimum, and work with, you know, like the ag community, what kind of sampling do you want to do for the ag communities? And
I can tell you
things like
zero.
Yeah, none. Open to it, right? So.
Hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that's an easy answer, right?
So, I mean, we're talking about sampling the BMPs for water quality?
No, I'm not, I don't want to go down that path, but if there's interest from these watershed groups that, you know, potentially they want to understand how their BMP is functioning, because you know, this data is essentially doing that, so it's giving us the baseline of what to expect.
Okay.
So no, I'm not saying that the county is going to require it. If there's an overwhelming interest, then we can be part of that discussion and figure out how to facilitate that. Maybe it's giving private owners or groups, whoever, you know, wants to get involved, feedback and a guide and things like that. And then if they're going forward with that process, sure, we'd like to get our hands on that data and maybe, you know, take a look at that. Or if it's municipalities like Brad, where he's getting data and things like that can be useful. We just want to be able to collaborate on that, but there's no intent to have a requirement to sample individual BMPs. The idea would be making sure that the maintenance steps are being done for that owner.
Well, and over time, if we are seeing significant issues in certain water bodies, that may influence future SMO standards for work within that particular watershed. That's where it's a big if. But as time goes on, if there are glaring examples of issues in certain water bodies or certain watersheds, that may influence future changes and requirements. That is to be determined in the future. The reliance on the Illinois Urban Manual is focusing on quality of the BMP and making assumptions. It's not looking for specific data at the inlet and outlet, at least at this point.
Right, but moving target, right? We don't know how this is going to evolve, how it's going to change. 10 years from now, whoever's in the room could be a completely different conversation. But to start out, the intent is not to get down to that nitty gritty. Who wants to go first?
I just a quick comment that maybe a future point of discussion with water sampling and pulling data from multiple sources, volunteers, other organizations. Would it be wise to have this is what we're looking for so that when we collaborate and we pull this data together, that it can be directly compared, because otherwise you're going to get, one group is sampling these 10 items, this group is sampling 3 items. They might be pulling samples differently. So maybe if we can reference one of those citizen science or the EPA, if anybody has like an outline, that might be good, because when we go to pull the data together, we want to be able to compare and contrast varying sources.
That's a good point, and
So in a future discussion.
once again, a lot of this will be decided on the watershed group basis, but I think that is where the county can come into play and influence the certain standards being followed. Your point's well taken. If you're using different methodologies, you can't compare the data. So we definitely would want to have standardization through the county for that type of thing. But once again, that's to be determined in the future. We're not dictating anything at this point. It's just this is the direction we see this going. And for the time being, it's building a foundation and just making an incremental step forward. Those are, we look forward to bringing that up in our watershed group meetings.
Joanne, would you put the cover page up so I can?
Oh, for this,
I think I
I'll
have
send
that
this out.
document, but
Yeah,
you'll
that
send
would be
it?
good.
I'll send it out.
That would be good.
Perfect.
I'll send the link.
Thank you.
There's a 2023 update in progress. So that is not quite out yet. But yeah, if you guys want to take pictures, I'll leave it up. To touch on your point, Brad, something that we do need to consider too is for our watershed planning for the 319 grant funding, we do have to relay any information that we have back into a format for the EPA so they can have an apples to apples comparison. So absolutely, we're going to need to develop some guidelines so that we can do that, even though potentially we want to operate on a more robust model. We can still have a way to tie back into them so that they can accept our plans and be open for funding, so.
I just want to make sure I misheard, and I hope I did. I thought you said if certain BMPs are not functioning, are found to be not functioning within a certain watershed, then we may have to change the standards for that watershed. I'm like, we're not going to try to break this ordinance down watershed by watershed, right? I mean, it's still going to be a global ordinance.
Well, that's a good point. And no, I was not saying if the BMP not performing. That was not any part of that.
Sorry, then I misunderstood.
Just as we learn more about the individual watersheds, then that may influence the types of standards that are required in the future.
But on all watersheds, not just on the ones that are.
Part of the whole driver of this watershed approach was to provide more specific, instead of having just a broad-based approach, was to provide some specifics for watersheds. So this, like the southeast corner, or southwest corner of the county is gonna be very different than the southeast corner of the county. And so part of the driver for the support from the county board for a watershed approach was to provide that flexibility.
Okay.
How that's gonna manifest itself, that is to be determined in the future, but that was part of the interest in having, and I thought you were actually one of
I said they're different, I said they are different in the way they react, but to try to make an ordinance that divides itself among, again, I'm always a problem with logistics, and that's.
You bring up a good point, but that is to be determined in the future. That's not
But
saying
technically,
anything.
if you're under a TMDL, you should be doing that already. So if you had a TMDL for one watershed and a TMDL for another watershed, and you were discharging out of both ends to do different, you're supposed to be addressing TMDL-A with your effluent and TMDL-B over here. Now, is that happening?
Technically, but I don't think that's occurring. I mean,
Well,
I understand what you're saying, and in a university setting, chemistry, running, yeah, sure, but I don't know that that's occurring, so,
Do we have
okay.
any TMDLs in the county? Is there one for the Fox?
There is one for the upper.
The upper Fox.
Yeah, down the Flint Creek, I think.
Yeah, we have impaired waters,
303D.
through a CD, but I think the TMDL in the Upper Fox, that's a recent.
So yeah, no one has probably addressed it in any of their MS4s, but there is language in the MS4 that suggests you're supposed to be addressing that. So whatever that, however you want to tidy that up in your MS4 permit, that's up to you. Other places in the United States, they have numerical models that have to show that their MS4 is reducing their input into that waterway that is under that TMDL, whatever that particular TMDL is. And you'd like to believe that'll eventually get here? Who knows? But that's kind of, I think, maybe what you guys are getting at, to a degree.
Well, and that's the whole idea of the watershed, is we just have two kind of very different areas and looking for very different solutions. And that's what we're hearing from constituents, what we're hearing from the county board, and this is the only way to really provide unique solutions to the different areas. So, could it get a little bit complicated? Yeah, I mean, watershed planning in general and water and everything is complicated, but hopefully we'll find a way to help disseminate that information with outreach and understanding so that it's in a digestible way for everyone. And yes, there will be some learning curves in there probably. Some of these things folks will have not even thought about or looked at, and so it will be a little foreign to them. Education is just as important now as it will be in the future, so.
I would say that once we get closer to that point, we will need professional help.
Well, yes,
I mean, like,
100%. No, we're not.
Well, no, State Water Survey, USGS, the guys that do this every day, because it's gonna be quite the spider web.
Correct.
So we're gonna need some guidance on what matters, what doesn't matter, priorities and all that, because that's where the rubber hits the road on all of that stuff to make it, if we're gonna have some kind of requirement, maybe it'll be worthwhile.
Well, and to Ernest's point, anything that we do, I was talking about systems approach. Create systems so that it's self-supporting and as simple as possible to implement. We in no way, shape, or form do we want to create a overly complex system, but it may not be a one-size-fits-all approach. And there has been a lot of interest expressed by the county board members, to not have just a one-size-fits-all. How that's going to shape into the future, you will definitely be part of that. But
As long as you want to, of course.
that is part of the interest in pursuing a watershed approach.
All right, well, since, just to move this along, I think for now, as I mentioned, we have the Illinois Urban Manual in there. We have the idea of having current studies. One other item I entered in here with the help of Darren is infiltration for 1 inch of runoff that references a portion of the SMO for infiltration along with the Crystal Lake watershed design manual that gets into pre-treatment design, all of that would help with recharge for the aquifers. So I don't want to get bogged down into the language too much. I think since everybody seems to be in agreement, what I'd like to do is just keep this, or go
Sorry,
ahead.
can I just make one note to that, Stoyan, is that for the infiltration of the 1 inch, it was only for major developments, so that we got away from this issue, and I think actually MWRD is right now updating their ordinance to kind of back off of some of their infiltration
Okay.
requirements, but this is consistent with that, so you're only really requiring it for the larger developments where they're putting in like stormwater detention and stuff, so it's not like single-family homes or even, you know, very small developments, it's for major developments.
And I put major developments in here just because the beginning section in here excludes general permits, but I also wanted to take out like public road development and those
Exactly.
things. So I did just specifically for major developments do that. So if it's okay with everyone, I'd like to just kind of table this for now. And if, Brian, if you would be able to coordinate a future call with, is it Mark or is it Mark and Paul? Yeah, with either Mark and Paul, maybe to present more information to us to see, to learn more about this document, how we want to incorporate it, and we can marry those two, and to Brad's point, kind of introduce a incremental step forward. And then I can kind of move into the other components of the agenda, if that's okay with everyone. So we'll go ahead and keep that, and then I'm gonna be out in August, so potentially we might just cancel that meeting, give everyone a break, but I'll coordinate with staff internally, but just FYI, so maybe this is something that we'll have Mark and Paul talk to us in September, and then by that time, hopefully introduce a more structured watershed planning approach. And again, filling in all those details, we'll get into that more and more. But one of our goals is to potentially have that watershed planning structure complete by around this time next year or even earlier, which I think we can do, but obviously there's a lot of pieces, so. So moving on, I will go ahead and move into new business for long-term maintenance enforcement for BMPs. I think we already kind of touched on that with our discussion. So something that we might want to think about is, as we're asking people to maintain their BMP, if they don't do it, what does enforcement look like? I don't really have a good answer for that. I don't think a fine is necessarily, where we want to go. But, if anyone has any thoughts now or items, as I mentioned, I think we the county's approach to this, just to reiterate, is to have these BMPs in a GIS tracking type system where then we can, much like any sampling or anything, produce guidelines for these folks to kind of track throughout the year, submit their information. We've got it logged, it's not sitting on a random spreadsheet on someone's computer. We can run reports and information and be able to act on it, and what that looks like in terms of if someone's not taking the necessary steps. That's, I think some discussion was like an SSA or something, or a fund, something along those lines. But Darren, do you have an idea?
I guess my question would be, what defines BMP being in poor maintenance, and how would you go, because one person could look at it, Vince would probably look at it one way, right? He would look at probably the vegetation, if it was like a rain garden, right? You're looking at the vegetation, I'd be looking at, is there sediment, what's the storage volume there? You get a homeowners association, they're looking at it completely differently. They're looking at how beautiful does it look probably, right? So, I think that's one of the things, if we're talking about maintenance of BMPs, what are we holding people to?
Well, the Illinois Urban Manual does talk about that, though it doesn't, some of this is gonna be open to us potentially taking this information and again, designing a guideline for these folks, so it is specific, so, hey, do this quarterly, and that task that we define would have to somehow incorporate some of these steps, or we'd have to come to a consensus. If you and Vince disagree on something, or maybe you agree on it, but it's the approach is a little bit different, you know, we'd have to figure out a way, and I think we have to do it in a way that's easy for owners to be able to execute that maintenance task.
Can I pose a suggestion and get some feedback?
Yeah.
So what if a requirement of the permit is to actually have a maintenance plan submitted as part of your permit process? So if you're gonna be designing and building a BMP, you know, you have the forethought to create a maintenance plan. And so if we require a maintenance plan to be submitted as part of the permit process, then that could be the standard that is held to into the future. So it would be, you know, change from, you know, BMP to BMP, but you have something that is basically agreed upon at the onset that you can then refer back to. It's, you know, does that seem like a reasonable approach? Is that being done any place else?
It's already in the ordinance.
Right, that's already
in the ordinance.
required.
Yeah, for.
Wetland, not the wetlands mostly, but wetland buffers and pond maintenance plans are required to get the permit. So it's there. I mean, maintenance is relative. It is vegetation related, keep the trees out of the buffer. You know, we're looking for erosion, pipes that have separated, you know, all those kinds of things. So there is some that are cosmetic and others that are more practical, you know, related to it, but the plan's there. Whether there's enforcement of the plan,
Well,
that's another matter.
And it's recorded, and it is recorded with the property. And the BMP
Yeah.
can be part of that.
We don't have to I feel like we don't have to reinvent the wheels because there are engineering plans, there's maintenance plans, all of that stuff is there for them to follow. And like my standard is make it meet the permitted plans for volume, restrictor, and, you know, vegetative standards that were laid forth in the maintenance plan. I guess, how do we enforce that though? Like, say they go in and fill a basin or half of a basin. How do you enforce it under the ordinance?
Well, and so there's probably two different enforcement. What you brought up in my mind is if they fill something, then in my mind, that would be, because it's going to be recorded. So a question we can have is whether or not we want those areas to be in an easement as well. Because if the property changes hands or someone tries to divide the pins, the new pins, at least that will carry over because part of the problem with recording is anybody, to kind of discuss it, anybody can go in and divide their property up without really having any knowledge of what they're doing. And so then when you do that and someone does that new research, they're potentially not gonna uncover some of this information. So that is something we have to think about, but in my mind, that's part of your stormwater management system that now you've changed, that was permitted, and so now you would be in violation because you've changed that without a proper permit. And so that might be a process where then, well, I don't want it anymore. Well, okay, if you don't want it, it still doesn't relieve you from this requirement. So you have to come up with an alternative versus the maintenance of it. You're not doing anything. You're like, well, and I highlighted this for an example, you know, someone could indicate, yep, I'm inspecting it, I'm making sure it's not accumulating sediment and debris. And so maybe this is an opportunity, like, do we have them potentially take a photo of this, you know, every month or whatever to try to establish is that happening on a quarterly basis? These are some of the things that I think we need to think of yes, inspection and removing accumulated sediment and debris is good, but when we have somebody actually try to execute that, how do we simplify it for them to then make sure that we know that they're doing it properly? And so maybe having a photo log that they can maintain is one idea. I mean, I don't know if these types of things we'd have to think, but I think it's two kind of separate things to me there. Is one would definitely be a violation where you're manipulating the existing stormwater system. One is more, hey, you're not maintaining it, and I don't, that's a little bit more of, is it a fine, which I feel like people are just gonna pay. They already do that anyway.
Well, and like, for example, in Spring Grove, like for the last 20 years, we've had them prepare a maintenance plan on developments with detention basins, with wetland impact, with anything that they need to maintain. And I think this is also a requirement in Lake County because we've been doing those forever. And then, for example, the developer, whoever the HOA needs to provide a yearly update on their maintenance activities to the village. So if you see something falling in disrepair, you can go to that entity. And we just had it recently with one of the commercial developers in the village last year. They weren't maintaining something. We went to them and said, investigated it and told them they needed to maintain it, and they came out and cleaned it all up. So if they don't, then the village has the opportunity or the ability to go in and clean it and back charge them.
Is that village code?
That's in the ordinance, I think, is that we put that in for anything that we have that they need to maintain. So it's in a drainage easement. So we have that in our easement language.
So it's specific to that village.
Yeah.
Right, but I mean, if you have an easement for these things, you can put in the easement language that you have the opportunity to go in and clean it and maintain it. I mean, that should be in any easement language, so people don't build fences across drainage ways, all that stuff,
There's the backup, the dormant SSA
Yeah.
is in the ordinance.
We've been using the dormant SSA probably forever, but that's what keeps the HOAs, because a lot of the old HOAs dissolved. They're like, why are we paying? We're not gonna pay for this anymore, But now with the dormant SSA, if you can make them pay more than their HOA fees, then it never dissolves.
Well, but if they're not in an HOA though, and they're an individual homeowner in the subdivision, older subdivision, potentially, not saying that we're gonna go retroactive on these, but, anyone with a BMP without that, how would a dormant SSA work there?
I think you can only do it going forward.
If it's not set up up front,
Yeah.
you can never
Yeah.
be able to enforce it.
Because the way the dormant SSA works is it's like 80% of the people need to agree to it.
Right.
So when there's a developer, that's it. He agrees to it, they implement it. But if you try to get 80% of an existing HOA that's dissolved, they aren't gonna agree to,
Well,
they're gonna
we
agree
can
to
certainly
their
offer it to them, but.
I've seen it happen in communities where they haven't had an active maintenance program or HOA fees for it, where their pond basically went to stink, right? And they were fed up with it. You had a large amount of the homeowners with water frontage, right? And they got sick of looking at, and obviously have a sediment problem. It was a riser, right, which is, kind of an outdated approach to outflow, and they basically created I wouldn't call it a formal.
It was
thing like that.
probably an SSA.
Right,
Or
but
they-
basically that's the approach, you're offering them something up that will allow them to put funds into
Right.
that particular project.
That's like an active SSA, and we've done those for low-pressure sanitary systems in communities where if there's a community benefit to it, you can get the owners to agree to an active SSA, and then they're all contributing to it, on a yearly basis. But the dormant SSA, theoretically, you never have to go to the taxes because their HOA fees are paying for the maintenance of their infrastructure.
Yeah, I feel like in the municipalities, it's probably easier. In the unincorporated areas, I don't know that we're gonna be going in and fixing this unless we try to develop some kind of partnership or program. Because and I hear this all the time, it's just, people are gonna say, okay, take it over, county, I'm tired of dealing with it.
Yeah.
And I
In
don't
DuPage
know.
County, the county goes in and fixes it.
So, and maybe that's just the reality that
Yeah.
that
You don't really, you
sooner or
know,
later.
a lot of that stuff might not even be in an easement. They put it on private property to make the property owner maintain it, but, you know, individual property owner is difficult, you know, to, you know, dredge out a sediment basin or dredge out a pond or something.
So Steve, do they back charge? Or does DuPage County just do it at their own cost?
Their public works group does it, yeah.
Okay.
They have a drainage program.
Oh, yeah, I guess part of the answer is setting up some kind of program to potentially go in and do the work and back charge that.
But I don't even think they back charge it because it's covered over, I mean, it's the unincorporated DuPage County residents are paying taxes to DuPage County.
Well, and certainly, this is probably a conversation that I would need to move up to the board.
I mean, at least in that case, it's spread over all the residents in the county that are contributing taxes to it. You know, when you start out with a small program and go fix some more critical items and just stick with it. But it's something that's gonna, you know, end up costing money, I guess, if you wanna fix it. And then there's no way, you know, how are you gonna, and sometimes when you do go in and fix it, then you can ask for easements, you can ask for other things from the property owners so that you don't have this issue recurring, you know?
Well, I think just to move the conversation along at this point, we'll just leave it there. I think what I'll do is we've got the, not county board, I'm sorry, the MCSC later this month. I will make it a topic and just tell them that this is kind of where our discussion is headed or has headed, and before we continue any further into developing ideas, let's see what their input will be.
What about reactivating the inactive drainage districts that are in the county?
Love to do that, yeah, and maybe part of the.
And that would be more to his point there, because there's a ton of them over there, small ones in Spring Grove area.
Basically a rural HOA.
Yeah.
And maybe it's part of our watershed planning that we want to do. Like I mentioned, I want to get a community together that, you know, looks at their watershed and has a quarterly meeting or an annual meeting that can discuss some of this. And maybe that watershed's like, you know what, let's create a fund. But that might vary watershed to watershed, so I'm not against that idea.
If they're in existence, you just gotta get them going again. So it's not as tough as making a new drainage district.
I know you said you wanted to move on, but I had a different idea of like a different branch
Sure.
for enforcement, and it's a limited target audience, but if a previous like permit applicant for a stormwater permit, whether it's with McHenry County or for one of the certified communities, if they have, and you were talking about cataloging and putting in a system for all these best management practices to see if they're being maintained, if a applicant is in the system and they have a BMP from a different permit that is found to not be in maintenance or they're not maintaining it, withholding approving a future permit until they've fixed the issues with their previous permits. That's a little extreme though, as I had that idea that sounded a little extreme, but maybe if the communities or the county know that they have outstanding issues with BMPs on their site, they have to fix those before they can be permitted to do new work.
I suppose. The problem with that though is how often am I gonna have an owner that I just is a thorn in my side for BMP, but then they're like, oh yeah, let me go get this permit to then be able to use that?
It would be a limited amount of people. It really only applies to people who get multiple permits, you know, as time goes on, but I don't know, it was just a thought.
The only other difficulty, although not a bad idea, I could very easily see someone come in, who had come in previously. They're gigged for, hey, you didn't do the previous one. So they turn around, they go to their attorney, they form an LLC, they form a corp, they form
Yeah, you can
something,
change-
and they
you
walk
can
back in and
change
go,
the name
well,
of the
here's,
organization
here's
that's
my,
applying
here's
for
my
permits.
thing, what, I don't
Yeah,
know, what are
that
you
thought
talking
crossed my
about?
mind too.
What are you talking about? So it'd be a little,
To your point though, I have that exact situation going on right now, and that's exactly what we're doing.
Yeah, if you have outstanding issues, you can't get a new permit until you've fixed the other problems.
They had a subdivision pond they were supposed to dredge, they didn't, this applicant, now they're doing another parcel in that same subdivision, still draining to that pond with this new one, and I'm like, well, you can't until you finish the conditions of the previous permit.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's different owner, it's different people though, right? It's like, they're different, they're two different entities that they're building for, but it's the same like company that's doing both of them.
Yeah.
So that's where my problem is they're like, oh, you're punishing this business in the municipality for the sins of a contractor.
Yep.
someone hired that contractor.
All right. Well,
Accessibility.
I will bring this up to the committee to get their thoughts. I think they're gonna like Mike's idea of reestablishing the drainage districts, or at least something similar. But I'll see what they say, and I'll come back to you guys, and we can follow up that discussion. So moving on to the agenda here. Ditch maintenance definition that was brought up last time. So don't know, I had highlighted this, so hopefully it came up in the agenda, but I'm pulling it up from the PDF that I made. So just gonna walk everyone through this. That's what I tried to do with the highlights through the SMO. So this is something that Tyler had brought up, and it definitely is, it's not clear. So one of the items under exempt developments is other maintenance activities. So if we then go to other maintenance activities and come to maintenance of drainage ditches, clearly it says dredging and the removal of obstructive, invasive, dead, dry vegetation outside of the floodway, provided that spoils are removed from the flood hazard area or spread thinly. I'm not gonna go through this whole definition here, but it's talking about drainage ditches. So if we compare that then to our general permit, it's for regulated development within flood hazard areas. So clearly this is allowing you to maintain within there as long as you're not within a floodway. But if we go to dredging, it says that applies to dredging channels. And we don't have a definition for channel or drainage ditch here. And obviously I can see where that's that distinction in that definition. So yeah, go ahead if you wanna.
We didn't get to the full litigation because it settled, but that was my whole,
But
that
either
was
way,
my whole
this is
point
still
with
an
this,
issue,
right?
yeah.
Was that, well, you say I can dredge, it's clear that it's an exempted thing, but if I have to be in the floodway, I have to be in the water in order to actually dredge, right? And I have to clear, and then if you go back to the top, it says that I can remove the vegetation and remove the obstructive, invasive, or dying vegetation. Okay, great. So Army Corps says tear it out, right? If I got a tree growing in the water or on the bank line, tear it out, and then I can reshape it and seed it, and we're good to go. Stormwater in the past has said no, you have to cut them off. I've even been told that you're supposed to spray the stump in the floodway, which is off-label, so shouldn't be doing that. But so I think the clarification is that, you know, we've got contractors, we've got farmers that, hey, I want to maintain this, but I don't know how. And then, okay, I do it, and I try and follow the rules, and then I get tagged. So the other thing that, straightening or widening, right? So a lot of these drainage ditches, I've got one that it was, that particular one, there was original engineering from the 50s. When it went in, they cut it all and they put it all in. Most of them don't have engineering. But
he goes, I didn't know I had the engineering until I got red tagged and he started doing some digging and found it. But he goes, I had to go down a foot to get the sediment off the top of the tile. And he goes, I know that tile had 6-8 inches of drop into the ditch before. So he goes, I went down another foot, and he goes, finally you could feel it with the loader. You could feel the difference. Well, okay, he goes, I know that didn't start like this. And once he found the engineering, he found out it was 10 feet wide before. So he goes, but for the engineering, right, he goes, with the loader, he goes, I started stripping it back and then you could see the edge of the wall, right, and the layers and the sedimentation. But he goes, how do I do that on these ones I don't have, right? So he goes, it looks like I'm widening it, but I'm really putting it back to what it was. It's been, sedimentation over 70 years. And he goes, and grass and trees and everything else. So I think that's where, looking for some clarification, and there's drainage ditches all over this county. And this particular one, when they did this, just to tie this back into the communities, Knoll Top subdivision is down in Coral Township. And I know the builder that put them in, he said those holes were wet when they went in, when the houses went in back in the 60s. And I had a phone call from a homeowner there and said, well, my place is always flooding, you want to sue the neighbor. I knew that they were ditching this northwest of them and all the water goes that way. I said, tell you what, take a year, call me back in a year, let me know if I fixed it. And he calls me back in a year, he really did, and he goes, I don't know what you did, but he goes, it's fixed. He goes, I don't get water in my yard anymore. Well, it was these guys maintaining the ditch and the tile lines. So, I don't know. That's why I think we need the clarification here, because there's people out there willing to do the work, but they don't want to do the work if they're gonna get caught and fined and hauled into court, so.
I completely agree, and as I mentioned, there's a small distinction where one says channel and one says drainage ditch. And I know, so just for clarity, and some of the maintenance components that, in terms of like removing a tree or something like that we tell people you may or may not need a permit. We're not sure there, because we don't know what that root structure is gonna do. We don't know how much backfilling might need to occur or what's gonna happen with that. So we often tell people, if you wanna cut it down to the stump, then you're guaranteed that potentially you're not gonna need a permit for it. So that's kind of the advice that we try to give people, especially in isolated areas. If it's more under Army Corps control, then we certainly leave it up to Army Corps to indicate that dredging activity. If you get a letter of no permit and it says, I'm gonna dredge 5 feet wide as part of that, and we can, and again, if we touch up the language so that it's clear that it's maintenance, then I would have no concerns related to those, and certainly.
Yeah, I think that's the other jurisdictional question, right, is because this project was happening right before Army Corps lost their jurisdiction. And they were claiming there was a wetland that fed this with a tile, and they said, no, this is ours. Well, after the jurisdiction change, was it 2 years ago already? Last summer. They're out completely. So this is all under counties.
Well, the jurisdiction thing is an honest question that needs to get looked at. So when, the whoever's considering maintenance, before, give yourself some time to go through that, because right now also, Army Corps has put a really low priority on those projects. We rely on Spring and her expertise and her knowledge of kind of what she anticipates the Corps would say yes or no to, but there are some areas where she's like, I really don't know. And then we have to coordinate with Army Corps, and they're a month out or 2 months out. And
I wish.
You don't have the direct connects. Just kidding. But that's kind of the, unfortunately, I don't know what to do about that, but, and I do think we probably need to take a look at this. So I just wanted to present that to the group and see, and to start that discussion. I didn't really have, any direction that I wanted to take here, other than potentially, do we want to get into defining a drainage ditch versus a channel?
Can you scroll back down to the other part that you said was in conflict?
Sure.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Well, I guess it's two-part there. Number one, a general permit applies to regulated development within flood hazard area. So if we're talking about doing dredging as part of maintenance, then dredging applies to dredging channels and ponds, where again, maybe that was the verbiage for drainage ditch to be the separator, but obviously, how would we define that? Or, you know, through definitions, and maybe this isn't something that we do right away right now, but.
That point, Rush Creek up by Harvard, I've got photos from, I think it's 39, they got a steam dredge out there, pulled by horses, and they cut all that in order to drain all of South Harvard and then down towards Marengo. So, is that a channel, is that drainage ditch? I mean, it's been dredged to drain. So those are the linguistics that I get into, and I go, I don't know.
Maybe
I'd say
channel if it was generic, added drainage ditches to it with this.
Well, if we had drainage ditches here, then it would impact, because how this started is an exempt activity is anything that falls under other maintenance activities, which is the maintenance of drainage ditches.
So one place says maintenance, and one place says you need a general permit for it, is that the issue?
Yes, because technically with this definition, so if you're not designated floodway, we just use the floodplain maps to check IDNR and you're not in a designated floodway. If you're gonna be dredging, you're technically gonna be in a flood hazard area, right? And so then what ends up happening is under General Permit 1, this applies to any regulated development within flood hazard area. Dredging is a part of that, and the dredging definition says that it applies to dredging channels. Again, not drainage ditches, but they're very similar, and trying to define them, even in our eyes, if we come to a good definition, I'm sure it's still gonna be a problem for regular folks trying to determine whether or not they would need a permit. And so it's either trying to define those lines or require a permit, because I just don't see any other way around it, or, you know, those are the two extremes. I don't know that there's a middle ground, potentially.
So do they need to, the general permit number 1 is just a permit that's basically just.
$250 permit, yeah.
Oh, okay, so it's the issue if they have to pay for the permit.
Potentially, or the fact that they would consider it maintenance, find themselves in a violation, then have to get the permit, pay a violation fee, just the whole headaches with that whole process. So there is this procedural element to it where potentially we would come in and say, you should have gotten a general permit for dredging this. We don't agree with your assessment of maintenance. That it's a
So
drainage.
what if it's a government entity though? Like a drainage district? You waive fees for townships?
You would be exempt because you're tax collecting body. So if you were to come in and you're not certain, is it maintenance or a permit, and you just want to get the permit and you're not going to pay any fees, yeah, you can, that's not. And even if you were in violation, it's a violation, so you're not paying any fees, so.
Does any of that come in conflict with the Illinois Drainage Code?
Well, certainly if you do it in a way that impacts a neighbor, then, right? But if you come in and you're just saying, I'm gonna dredge that, there's still the execution component. Under a permit, we would be able to go out and inspect and confirm. Whereas if it's just maintenance, then you wouldn't have that ability. If I'm the downstream owner and you did a bad job and now I feel like I'm impacted, I would be calling the county and saying, hey, this person didn't do it properly, and I'd say, well, they're exempted because it was a maintenance activity. Their protection lies under the drainage law, but they have to hire a lawyer.
What about in the wording, though, if you looked at the Illinois Drainage Code to get some clarification on this?
If it's in there, I have not looked at that, and we can certainly get the state's attorney to look at that.
So what's the difference between a channel and a drainage ditch?
You tell me.
They're not defined.
They're not defined, no.
All ditches are channels, but not all channels are ditches.
Right,
I mean, because like a roadside swale could be a channel.
Yeah.
But you wouldn't automatically call that a ditch. You know what I mean? The ditch to me is below ground filled with water. You know, I mean, the classic ditch, drainage ditch standpoint as opposed to a roadside ditch, which would be more of a roadside swale.
Well, ditch is in channel, in the channel definition. So if you go to channel, it says ditch.
Oh. Yeah, okay. Let me pull that up real quick.
Is there any stipulation on how long water's in there? You know, like a channel would have water all the
Ditch is
time,
not
where a ditch
defined.
would.
Ditch should be defined in the SMO. But there's so many, I mean, there are dry channels and, you know.
There's dry ditches.
And wet ditches, dry
Yeah.
channel.
Especially this year, there's a lot of wet ditches.
Any river, stream, creek, brook, branch, flow path, ditch is in there, so, okay, let's just muddy the water. Yeah, so I mean, that's kind of the, hey, it says here I can do dredging.
What was the intent originally? I mean, when this was written, not so much the definition, but the other maintenance activities was written into the ordinance. There must have been an intent by somebody
It was to allow for maintenance of ag ditches. That was the separated out.
Without needing to
Yeah,
talk
there's,
into it.
here's kind of a full list. It's replacement of existing driveways, parking lots, repair of those, again, repair, in kind, existing culverts. So it seemed like it was just more or less trying to allow for repair of maintenance of things without bogging things down procedurals and fees and things like that.
Because this allows maintenance of drainage ditches and dredging of ponds and other maintenance activities. And this general permit of dredging seems to be very duplicative of that. So I do see where the issue would come in, is that even somebody dredging a pond, here we allow them to do it under other maintenance activity, but then it's also specified in this general permit. I mean, could we just, get rid of the general permit, or make the general permit only required in very specific situations?
That was my thought. You either remove the general permit or you either remove the maintenance activity.
Based on what you're saying for how the maintenance activity was originally put in, I think a lot of people would be upset if you remove the maintenance activity.
Right.
So then you want to.
The dredging for the general permit is also, goes along with the regional permit 3 for IDNR and the nationwide permit, which are self-issuing as well. So I guess if we want to look to a place for a precedent, Army Corps and IDNR are basically saying, hey, if you follow these rules, we're not concerned. So we could potentially remove dredging from the general permitting process and maybe indicate here that it's allowed as a maintenance activity as long as you're following the nationwide permit and IDNR regional permit 3.
Yeah, that's what I would
Probably.
As a potential.
So I guess the only issue there would be that if you tried to, because you're talking about regional permit 3, which is a floodway, right?
Correct, which this says it's outside the designated floodway, which we can leave that in there, but what about non-designated floodways? Technically, you would need a permit, which the regional permit 3 would cover. So I feel like you'd cover everything, but again, I haven't fully thought this out because I wanted to open up for discussion, because that's kind of the two extremes that I saw. I don't know if we can find a middle ground to keep both.
I think regional permit 3 covers designated floodways. You'd have to go to a statewide.
Okay, so maybe you're right, maybe it is.
I'm almost thinking, can you just make the dredging general permit cover dredging in the floodway and then attach those requirements?
They don't want to pay for
difficult
the general permit. I think that's the idea, that when they need a permit for the drainage ditch, they don't want to have to pay for the general permit. But like in Spring Grove, we don't charge for a general permit. So if it's a self-issuing permit, like general permit 1 or 2, for a routine project, it's self-issuing and they don't pay.
And we can certainly look to do that with the general permits, which all would be self-issuing under nationwide and regional permit 3, just if we wanted to, but for this one specifically, I'm more along the idea of removing the dredging component and adding more language to the maintenance part that indicates you have to follow these different steps, or at least even maybe putting, hey, you're allowed to do this maintenance activity as long as, and it already outlines a lot of what that step is, spreadly thinning, that it's outside of the flood hazard area, that it's gonna be hauled away, et cetera. So it's almost a duplicative thing in one fashion of saying you can do it without a permit, in another location it's saying you need a permit.
Right.
And I don't necessarily,
And the
I'll say
general
this,
permit allows for ditch widening, which was the other issue. There's nothing
the
about ditch
general
widening in the
permit, I
general
don't know. I don't know that it has any reference to ditch widening. And maybe I have to go to the definition of dredging.
I think it would fall under the new channel. I think that was
Yeah.
the issue.
Yeah, if it falls under a design.
And that's kind of what Tyler was pointing out, was what's a new channel, what's the definition of a new channel.
I don't think this ever was intended for widening, this general permit here, the general permit of dredging. I think it was just for maintaining existing, so I don't think.
For reestablishing the natural original design condition, which was what he was saying was they were doing when they ultimately found the plans, but.
Right, which if he's able to show, hey, it was meant to be 10 feet wide, and he can show that documentation, then we would certainly allow him to dredge to that. But if they can't show that, then we would just say, here's kind of the new natural bank areas, you can't widen further.
Yeah.
But removing this, I guess, I'm trying to think, I haven't really seen any issues that have stemmed from dredging that I'm aware of. So if we were to, I guess what I'm going with is, if we were to remove this, I don't anticipating all of a sudden the county starts seeing all of these issues because we haven't been issuing dredging permits. Because it's a similar idea, they're removing it, that the information's in both places. So I don't know. Are you guys feeling that we should potentially remove dredging from the permitting process and just, yeah?
So one last question with this, and that is a thought I had. How would we make sure, so I'm thinking like a farmer that wants to dredge a long distance. How would we make sure that they're putting in some sort of erosion control practice in there? With general permit 1, I think somewhere in there it says they have to use soil erosion and sediment control, but.
Well, it says it in the maintenance definitions.
Oh, great, okay.
So, like I said, everything's in here, it's just, yes, potentially what would happen is we would get a call and, we would get an indication that they're potentially not utilizing this. So then we would issue a violation, hey, you don't have proper soil erosion control. And so to rectify that violation, it would be installing that, and then potentially the violation would be removed. And I don't know if there's any cleanup that would be involved. We had our sediment erosion control section update that required from a violation to have, cleanup, removal of debris that's deposited, et cetera. So I think we would be covered there, but we can, if this is the path we decide to go down, just leaving this or revising some of this language, then we can certainly go back to that.
Wasn't there a half-mile distance requirement?
There is a distance requirement as well, so we can take this information and, again, pop it up into the maintenance portion. as a potential solution, yeah.
Well, unless you're doing stream bank restoration, I don't really think that would,
Correct.
you're just gonna dip the erosion that's down in the bottom.
And we do have stream bank restoration as part of a general permit here. I didn't print out that section. I can go to that, but yeah, it would not include
You're not
that. So
reshaping.
you can dredge without the permit, but then if you needed to do some armoring or putting some stone down, then you would need to get the general permit for laying that down, because now you're potentially bringing in new material as well. Which is a little bit different than using what's already out there.
And that was also tailored around the nationwide permit.
Yeah, everything is
So
tailored around
everything-
nationwide and regional permits.
Everything works with the self-issuing permit.
Correct. So all of the general permit ones that are related to a nationwide with the IDNR Regional Permit 3 are tailored off those standards, which again, federal and state have now said, we don't want you coming in for permits, here's the guidelines, it's up to you to do it. So we can look at following suit if we wanted to, or keeping this here for some of these other products, so stream bank restoration, potentially something that maybe we want to have a permit for. But it's open for discussion. Opens the door, I guess, with this little discrepancy here.
Yeah, if anything, I would significantly reduce the cost of a general permit or eliminate it, because I think that was the whole idea of the self-issuing general permits. But, that's obviously up to you and the county. We don't have that cost in Spring Grove. I don't know about other municipalities, but if it's a general permit that, I always felt that was the same as the self-issuing permits, and the whole idea is not to be onerous. That if
So,
people are following the rules,
I guess
then they're spending their money to fix something, why add extra cost to it?
then per that idea, then I would say we should remove the maintenance of drainage ditches, and it's basically a free permit that the farmer still has to, or whoever, still has to come in for a permit, they're just not paying any fees. And remove this section then, because I feel like we have to remove one or the other.
Yeah, I guess, it sounds like there's other, maybe stream bank restoration or other things in there that potentially could trigger the cost for the same thing.
And this one's specific to dredging of ditches, and then as Darren pointed out, dredging of ponds. So that one general permit discusses that, so it's either
Maybe farmers will consider even coming in to be onerous, I don't know.
Did GP1 require plans?
Yeah,
That would be
requires a
much more
sketch.
expensive than $250.
But it doesn't have to be like an engineered plan or anything.
Okay.
So it can be an area where the person can highlight, I'm gonna do this stretch and I'm gonna put my spoils over here type of thing. And because we have 1 foot contours, they can also use that to generally see where they're gonna put it in a location. So it's not, so yes, there is a little bit of a procedural element to that. And if those are the two ideas, what we can do is I can throw it up to the committee to see which one.
But if somebody, if you make it so that it's a no-fee permit, and a person doesn't go get the no-fee permit,
right,
they can still be cited with a violation, which can have a fine. If they go do it without going in and getting their permit.
Correct. The problem though is the fine is based off the original permit fee if there's no original permit fee.
But now there's no fine, so, it becomes, okay, you just lost the whip, how do you get the horse to go? What?
That doesn't mean that they don't have to, come and comply and get the permit and to go through the effort and do the paperwork. We can still send them, if they're not compliant, we can still prosecute them under the ordinance violation for not getting the appropriate permit. But there wouldn't be the financial obligation. Now, if they go to court, then there's court fees, and we can assess a minimum fine because it's a separate component, yeah.
What was the purpose of putting the half mile in here?
I think it comes from one of the nationwides or the IDNR Regional Permit 3. I should have pulled those for you guys to have that. I didn't think we'd be getting into this detail, but it comes from the half mile and the 20,000 comes from one of those documents. I don't know if it's the nationwide or the Regional Permit 3. It might be both.
Cause I got a ditch that's about 1.5 miles long.
So technically then you would not qualify for a general permit, you'd be looking at a minor development permit.
Could he, in lieu of that, go for 3 permits? I mean, I'm being stupid, but.
Or 3 years of no permit.
Yeah, go 1 year, half mile, 1 year, half mile, 1 year, half mile.
It's not like phasing it out, generally we don't like to see that, but I can it's hard sometimes.
Once the machine's there, it's there.
The hydrologic disturbance just doesn't, otherwise if you had 30,000, you'd have to go to a minor development. That's why the general permit is
20,
waives
right.
that. That's part of our own, but I think the half mile is for one of those other nationwide.
Right, yes, sorry, yeah, the 20,000 is the cutoff between minor and intermediate, and that's the cutoff between needing an engineer to sign and stamp your plans. So that is more of an SMO component. The half mile is the one that's coming from.
So if we get rid of this completely in the general permit, and all dredging of any type is considered a maintenance activity, could somebody go out and say they're gonna dredge 3 miles of whatever?
Not if we decide to have it's maintenance up to a certain length of.
Okay, so we would pull some of this stuff into the maintenance.
Into the maintenance language, or we would structure it a little bit more so it's not this chunky paragraph to then say maintenance of drainage ditches, blah, 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 is allowed if these following conditions are followed, and we can list those as an example. But, all right, well, I think what I'll do is I'll take it to the committee to see what their preference is. Maybe they want to just, in general, for all general permits, or maybe those that make sense, move them out or go to, fee structure and remove the maintenance activity at that point. And I will let you guys know. There's no other discussion. Okay, well, we don't have any reports. Any future topics that anybody wants to bring up? No? Any announcements?
Yeah, we've got the water forum coming up September 18th, and but I don't have anything else besides that.
Also, I didn't throw this in, we're doing a event September 21st it's our Fox River Day?
It's our River Day.
It's our River Day. So there's gonna be information on that. We're gonna send some information, but we're looking to paddle a portion of the Kishwaukee.
Nipperson Creek.
Why don't you know?
So we're gonna do a second segment of Nipperson Creek. We'll be going by the wetland bank that's been established and doing very well. But we're gonna have the geologist with the Illinois State Geological Survey that I work with is putting together information on the geology of Nipperson Creek and the Fox River watershed. And then we'll have a representative from MCCD talking about the ecology of the area. And then we'll paddle from, I don't remember the two, what's the one on the north far end?
From Keystone to Solon, I believe is the plan.
Okay. And, we'll be providing the canoes and kayaks, complements of MCCD. So it really should be a fun and informative trip.
And you can bring your own, and then what I'll do is I'll release some information on the website. There's a lot of other entities that are doing events throughout the, different watershed areas. So if you live somewhere closer and you see something, you can sign yourself up. But anyway, sorry for butchering that. Thanks, Scott.
When was that? I'm sorry.
September 21st.
Is that running in parallel with it's our Fox River Day?
Yeah,
that's what it is. Yeah. If I would have done a better job, that would have been clear.
So this is, yeah, the Nippersink is tributary to the Fox River, so it ties in with our Fox River Day.
Correct.
Where are we at for precipitation for the year? I mean, as far as how much above average?
We're at 30 inches.
30 already?
Since March.
Yeah.
End of March.
Even as a water guy, I'm kind of tired of it.
So are we.
It's been real interesting watching our water tables, and, you know, if you are interested in it, you know, we have 37 monitoring wells throughout the county. You can go on to our website, McHenryH2O.com, and you can access any of the well logs since 2009. But it's been real interesting watching the water levels drop precipitously during the drought from 2020 to 2023, and watching the recovery. Now, not all aquifers have recovered the same. So if you have an aquifer underlain by 100 feet of clay, that's going to recover much differently than one that's 100 feet of sand and gravel. But it's been real interesting watching the recovery.
With no data to support it, I think the Nippersink is as chocolatey as I've ever seen. From the highway, it's just muddy.
My home farm, 27.07 inches.
What's the normal? If you said 30 is what we have,
30 to 36 is a normal for a year. You know,
and we already have 30.
I just pulled up 27.07 inches on my home farm.
Yeah,
Since January 1 for me.
All right, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll make that motion.
By Jody, do I hear a second?
Second.
Second by Bruce, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, meeting adjourned.
Great seeing everybody.
Okay, now we can discuss our
I like your tie, Ernest, that you had me here.
Thank you, I like it too.
This more has to go to some of the students, professors and spring. One actually goes back a year.